Hi everybody, David here for ChessDojo, and today I want to talk about streaks in chess, and in particular winning streaks, not losing streaks or drawing streaks, even though in professional chess drawing streaks are certainly more common, and I've seen many tournaments recently. I don't have to look further back than the Sinkfield Cup, where players have literally drawn every single game they've played, go into a tournament, play 9 games in a row, draw all 9 of them. Gukesh, for example, at the Sinkfield Cup. But such drawing streaks have become quite unremarkable. Once upon a time, Peter Lecca was famous for them, then Anish Giri was famous for them. People would make jokes, how they should publish my 60 memorable draws or my 60 boring draws or something. But now it's become so commonplace that people hardly remark on them, and what has become much more rare are winning streaks. And recently there was a pretty eye-opening streak by the young German player Vincent Keymer. He's 19 years old and has been a super grandmaster for 2 years now, so he is one of the hottest prospects on the chess circuit, one of maybe 6 or 7 teenagers to emerge in the last 5 years who look like potential world championship candidates at some point. Now, Vincent Keymer was playing in the Akiba Rubinstein Memorial in Poland, a 10-player round robin, very, very typical format for professional tournaments at this point, meaning 9 games against each other opponent in the tournament. And he started off the tournament by winning 4 games in a row. And to give you a sense of how likely that is, or how many coin flips it is, so to speak, you have to realize that, and those of you who have been following chess for a long time will realize this, that chess isn't like a win-loss coin flip. It's not a 50% chance to win or lose, which you then just multiply a half by a half by a half by a half and figure out the chances of winning. At a 2700 level, and this tournament was played at approximately a 2690 average rating level. At a 2700 or Super GM level, in general, they're drawing about 70% of their games, maybe even a little bit more above 2700. This tournament's maybe a touch below. So often it's something more like the player with white has a 20 to 25% chance of winning, the player with black a 5% chance to win, and then 70-ish% chances of a draw. So for argument's sake, let's say Vincent, who was the strongest probably player at this tournament, let's say Vincent had a 25% chance to win any game he played against these opponents here, and that's a very high estimate, right? Because sometimes he's got black and that chance should be quite a bit lower. But generously estimating that he has a 25% chance to win a game, to win 4 games in a row, the chances are less than 0.5%. If you just do 1/4 to the 4th power. So definitely that already shows it's a fairly rare occurrence. Now, I just want to talk briefly. I'm going to show you a bunch of his games from this tournament with my thoughts on them. But I thought to myself, in general, what could be the cause of somebody having a streak in chess? And I thought of a couple main options. Number one, form. There are some players who are by their nature streaky, and they may come into a tournament just on really good form. Everything's clicking. They're calculating their best. They're feeling their best physically and in every way. So sometimes it could just be form. Someone comes in exceptional form. Another thing could be prep. If somebody's been doing a lot of work recently, how many times your prep comes up is a little bit of also a percentage kind of crapshoot, right? You prepare a certain number of openings. You've got some really good ideas or weapons here or there, and then there's other openings where it's serviceable, but maybe you're remembering some lines from 2 years ago, or maybe the lines you have are pretty are pretty dead and equal. Depends, right? But everyone's walking around with a certain amount of weaponry and a certain chance that those lines are going to come up. But if you've just been doing a lot of preparation recently, you've got more chances that people fall into some prepared line of yours, and you get sort of a gimme point or a real hand up towards winning the game from your opening prep. And one place you often see this is people who participate in a world championship match. They do an inordinate amount of opening prep for 3-4 months before the world championship match, and then right after the world championship match, and we saw this even with even if they lose the world championship match, you'll see often the winner and loser of the world championship match in their next tournaments just getting a lot of points out of their prep because they've got this remaining prep that they've just done recently. So I think that could be a second factor if you've just been doing a lot of work on your openings. A third factor could be low respect. If you're not super high rated and not yet established as a top player, you'll often see players make their entrance into the top ranks with a streak because people don't yet realize how good they are, so they may play a little bit disrespectfully against them, which could be the higher rated players, the more established players might see certain options and think, oh, it's complicated, it'll work out for me, they won't be able to handle this. And just in general, people will take more chances against people they have less respect for, and that also gives more chances to the player who's receiving less respect. And then I think another way you could sometimes get a streak would be the opposite, too much respect. So if you have some kind of an aura of invincibility, and if you think back in history, many world champions had this a little bit, then you can intimidate people and they can be scared into making concessions and getting into trouble. So I'm going to give you two examples of two different auras. So Garry Kasparov, he had an aura that he was going to out-calculate you, that he was going to out-prep you, that once he got the initiative, he would never let go, and he would tear you to pieces. So people would be afraid to go into complications with him, and they might make some concessions trying to simplify the position, trying to avoid what they thought his greatest strength was. But then if you're doing that, then you're giving him advantageous endgames by always making little concessions to try to simplify the game. Opposite side of that, Magnus Carlsen, who came after him, has a reputation for being able to win any endgame, including drawn endgames. So then you get the opposite thing where people are so terrified by the slightest pull that he could get in an endgame, by the smallest imbalances and stuff, that that there's this fear, this I'm going to lose, where normally you would see those options and you would think, that's sort of safe ground. If I can steer the game there, I can hold that endgame. Suddenly you don't have that confidence. He's going to test you so hard, and then you don't quite believe in your ability to hold it, and then you make other decisions trying to avoid all these endgames that you're suddenly scared of that you wouldn't normally have to be afraid of. So to me, those are four theoretically reasonable ways that you could cause a huge streak. But I think none of them actually really explains what happened for Vincent Keymer at this tournament in Poland. And maybe this shows a little bit how theoretical thinking is often super far away from reality, right? You can sit in a room by yourself and stare at the ceiling and dream up all kinds of reasons, and then you go out in the street, or in this case, the hotel where people play chess, and you find something totally different actually happens. So I looked at Keymer's streak, and we're going to go through it together, and I don't think that any of these things are really at play in his streak. And I looked at, I also looked for, as prep for this video, I looked back at one of the most famous modern streaks, which is Fabi's 7 wins in a row at the Sinkfield Cup. And it also didn't, as far as I could tell, didn't really follow any of these four. None of these four factors was the dominant factor in any obvious narrative way to me. So to quickly go over Fabi's streak, I think he had one game where his preparation basically won him the game or got him really well started on winning the game in the second round. And he had one game where his prep was helpful but not totally decisive, but it got him a position that he was comfortable with and that's a little modern, and that his opponent Topalov was a little less confident with. But it wasn't a complete slam dunk, and he played very well there. And then I neither felt like people gave him too little respect nor too much respect. One of the weirdest things about looking through those games now, only 10 years later, right? And how much chess has changed, is that it looked to me like in every single game, his opponents kept giving him chances. I basically never saw somebody try to kill the game through 9 rounds that I reviewed. And even though he drew in rounds 8 and 9, I thought he was basically either winning or close to winning in both of those games against Magnus and Hikaru. And neither of them tried to, draw, save, stop his streak by drawing him, They played full-blooded games with him. So 9 rounds in a row, people were giving him chances and they were trying to fight him. Obviously, they must have noticed that he was playing really well. And nowadays, I feel like there's a huge percentage of players, especially in these high-level round robins, who will be very reasonable and they'll say, oh, this guy's on a hot streak, I'm just going to try to draw that game. I'm not just try to draw it. I'm going to try to kill the game from the opening. I'm going to try and play main lines, opening prep, as many computer moves as possible, and really just kill the game into something dead and equal and, not too complicated to play. Fabi got like 9 rich positions in a row. And so his opponents didn't have this kind of sense of self-preservation or playing it safe that we're used to, that I think we're used to seeing now. So part of it is almost a change in eras, even though it's only been 10 years, I think. And the only one of my 4 factors that I think really applies to some extent is that Fabi was on fantastic form, right? I mean, he just played amazingly. And I do think that Fabi at that point was very much still coming out of being a calculation-based player, although he played fantastic strategic chess in that tournament, as I was reminded playing through all the games. But fundamentally, he'd come up as a calculator, and his calculation was really, really on during that tournament. And I think that normally the players who will have more of a difference in their form and more streakiness, both winning and losing or failing to win, are going to be players who are fundamentally calculators. And Fabi's a fully well-rounded player now, and he played quite well-rounded at the Sinkfield Cup. But at that point, he was more of a calculator than anything else, and he was definitely on top form there. Now let's talk about Keymer. I don't think that really applies to Keymer. To me, Keymer is a very solid, technical player, calm, measured, positional, strategic, and even within positional and strategic, often kind of, clean classical pawn structures would be an emphasis of his, I think. He has a more limited repertoire than most of the current generation of top professional players. And it's a, pretty calm repertoire. So I don't think he relies on crazy calculations, and I don't think his form should really go up or down that much from what I've seen in his other games. His repertoire, by the way, for folks who don't know Vincent that well, is that as white, he plays the closed openings, so d4, and then c4 and knight f3, which often transpose to d4 openings. As far as I can tell, he's basically never played e4 in a professional game. If he has, it was super rare. Most players now play d4 and e4. So that's the white repertoire. Then with black, he plays Queen's Gambit declines, and generally with an e6 move order. Sometimes knight f6, e6. He'll occasionally play Nimzo Indians. So that's an Indian exception. But to me, the Nimzo Indian plus Queen's Gambit is still a pretty consistent set of positions and a solid and somewhat limited repertoire in terms of pawn structure. So you don't see, King's Indians and Bankos and Dutch defenses out of Vincent. He's playing really correct pawn structures and classical central control. And against e4, he's mostly playing the Ruy Lopez and the Sicilian. That may already sound more diverse than the other parts of his repertoire, but that's a typical repertoire for a strong positional player, that you've got e4, e5 for games where you're more happy to draw, in case your opponent plays well. And then you've got Sicilian if you really want to try and push your opponent to lose more. And he's a great Sicilian player and a good English player. As I said, he plays d4, but also, c4, knight f3. So what you'll see in this tournament is that Vincent gets the same opening basically in the first 3 rounds, and that proves to be, I think, a big factor in this streak that he puts together here. If there is any factor in it, my overall sense is that it's a little bit of a coincidence that a couple good games just happened to come together for him, and the right opening, the right opponent here and there, and it just happened to be 4 games in a row. But that his form was basically good but normal, not like he was going to win all 9 games in a row. So let's start looking at the games. And here we've got Keymer playing a Najdorf Sicilian as black. And I think that there is an advantage as I start playing some moves for you. This is a typical structure for the Najdorf where white's played e takes d5. White's played kind of just a kind of nothing variation against his Najdorf. So it's just sort of a general Najdorf structure. There's not a very specific attacking plan for white. And I think the Sicilian is a really good opening against somebody who's not prepared. I think white, a lot of people are scared to play the white side of the open Sicilian. And I think it's because if you don't get preparation, if you don't get an immediate something going on, there's a lot of positions where the long-term positional trend is against you. There's also less dead positions, so you've got I think white probably loses a surprisingly high percentage of games in the open Sicilians. So it's going to be a little bit less drawish, a little bit more games sort of trending against white if they're not prepared. And I think you can see that just at every level, people are kind of aware of that, and a little bit, you'll find lots of people who are afraid of the white side of the Sicilian. Many of them will still play it because they feel like on principle they have to, but then if they aren't theory hounds and they're not prepping a lot, then they'll often flounder about like Bartel did in this game. So it's a typical structure, as I say. Black's got the pawn majority on the king side in a plan of trying to push it. White's got the pawn majority on the queen side, and the main break is c4, c5, which, as I recall, white never gets close to in this game. So, yeah, avoids the queen trade because he wants to play on the king side. And white plays f4. It's a lashing out that doesn't really work out. It's in fear of, it's a prophylaxis against black's going to put the bishop on e5. Then you won't be able to challenge it anymore. And the bishop's going to radiate both sides of the board on 2 longish diagonals. And then the plan is f5, f4. So in this case, I think Keymer had a cool idea to bring the bishop to e5 before playing f5 from a position like this. F5 is also a standard move, but then before your bishop gets into position, white's bishop will be challenging for those squares. So anyway, this was a cool idea, bringing the bishop first. White notices some kind of danger, tries to fight back against it, makes this pawn trade of a center pawn for the h6 pawn with this tactic, and here, and then Keymer just says, well, I still have, more pawns here. He wants to recapture with the d pawn, push it to e4, set up insanely crushing pair of pass pawns deep in white's king position. So white's reluctant to trade on e5, and they get this tactical battle that comes up. And yeah, to get rid of the f-pawn, white makes this trade of queen for 2 rooks, and black's able to mop up pretty easily because of white's king position being weak along the second and first ranks. So that was the first win. And what I wanted to say about something that's helping him is that he then plays the English opening as white, and so he manages to get Sicilian, English, Sicilian in his first 3 rounds, the same kind of position. In my opinion, and of course these guys are playing at a totally different level than anything I've ever experienced, so this may be irrelevant to 2700 level chess. You'd have to watch chess videos by better people than I, or chess commentary by better people than I. In my own experience, there's an advantage to playing the same opening or structure multiple times in a tournament. I mean, there's potentially a disadvantage in your opponent's prepping for you, but if they don't happen to, get you in some prep, having the same position multiple times in a row, I feel like you play a bit better when it's really fresh and you've just been looking at that structure a couple days ago. I had a tournament like that recently with the same kind of opening as Vincent, where I got several Najdorfs in one tournament, and I just felt like I was really locked in and refreshed on everything that I wanted to do in the Najdorf and feeling extra comfortable in those positions. And what I mean to say is, even if you've been playing an opening for 10 years and you've got hundreds of games under your belt, if you haven't played it in a tournament game in the last 2 weeks, you might not play it at the same level as if you're playing it 2-3 times in one tournament. That's just a little tiny side theory that may or may not hold up at their level, but I think holds at most levels, that you just be a little bit more locked in when it's really fresh and recent. So here, Keymer just makes a very typical maneuver for the English and the Sicilian as a whole, which is to bring a knight to the c5 square, poke at these pieces. You can then follow up on the c file with knight takes a6 threats because of the knight on c6 sometimes hanging. Now, obviously, you don't forget a theme like bringing the knight to the c5 because you haven't played the English or the Sicilian in a few days. It's not at all that I'm saying. Obviously, Vincent knows about bringing the knight to c5. Even I can't forget about bringing the knight to c5. It's just that you're looking at 5 or 10 different typical options that you have, and when you're really into it and really on form and you've just been making those same decisions recently, you just more quickly recognize or calculate which one is appropriate in which situation. So the knight on c5, bishop has to come back to cover that. Sarana was bringing the rook out in time to do this. Obviously, he also knows about knight c5, right? White unveils the second bishop. Both knights were blocking both the Fianchettoed bishops, so now they're both in action as the knights maneuver out of the way. Here you see the introduction of the knight takes a6 threat. All right, so Sarana goes pretty passive. He wants to put the pawn on c6 to kill these pieces and redeploy the knight here, and then everything will be good. For a moment, though, he's kind of passive, right? And he had to move this rook twice to stay out of the way of his back rank maneuvers for the minor pieces. And Vincent here finds a really good moment to advance in the center. So in the Sicilian, you often want to play d4 to trade off white center pawn and gain more space for your pieces. But if you go d4, you have to worry about e4. So sometimes you'd like to play e4 first to follow up with d4, but then you have to make sure that you still control the d4 square. Well, this knight just ran away from it. So here he has that pretty easily. And the other thing you have to worry about with e4 is the opponent pushing past and just going for g5, g4, f3, killer attack. This move is almost killer. It's threatening f4. He's got the room to follow it up, but both the knights are passive, and Keymer has just calculated that against f4, he has this strong resource, d4. And this basically wins a pawn for him. His queen's covering the f3 pawn fork. And he wants to go d takes e5. Which is kind of smothering. Black traded on d4, and he took back here, and he can recapture this isolated pawn afterwards. And he did, and he eventually won the game with the extra pawn. This is a very nice pawn mass, so the position, I would guess, is theoretically winning, or computer level winning, even though it's just one pawn, because it's a nice mass. You've got a good strong point from which to win the game. Now his third game in these positions, he's playing as black, defends correctly with a Sicilian, has an easy time, gets the equality, and here they trade into an endgame where I think basically a computer would probably say it's equal more or less, but a human from my generation, which Harikrishna is kind of my generation, he got good at chess before computers were overwhelmingly good. Someone from pre-computer generations would think that white has a tiny edge. And Harikrishna is an excellent technical player with a lot of confidence in his endgame. And he would probably think white has a tiny edge or something to hope for or play for based on this a6 pawn being on a light square, right? And both players having these light squared bishops. Okay, black's pawn structure is largely stuck on light squares and white on dark squares, which can favor white's bishop and in various endgames. So what happens here is Vincent is going to benefit from a very, very famous thing in chess, the overpress, right? He makes a good choice with b5, so white's not directly attacking this, and his rooks can get moving. But still, white's thinking, the a6 pawn is vulnerable. It's on light squares. There's this breakthrough. If this knight could come to c5. Oh, if this knight could come to c5. This bishop's probably preventing the beginning of knight maneuvers by jumping into the center so quickly. You can see his priorities in the endgame, right? First, gets the bishop in the middle, taking away some squares from the knight. And then b5, so his rooks can play. But white can't really win the a6 pawn here. Can't really get the knight to c5. So black defends, and he goes passive. And here I think he should have still gone, if I'm not mistaken, rook c7 and rook a7. And even though you're not going to win this pawn, you keep black honest because you're attacking black's weaknesses. After he retreats in the game with rook c1, Keymer's actually able to suddenly slightly take over the position. He maneuvers the knight to c6, and suddenly white's b pawn is horribly, horribly weak. Beautiful move from Vincent here with bishop b1. Maybe Harikrishna had overlooked that this knight maneuver could be played because it sort of traps the bishop. But f3, white's pieces are hanging on the e file to black's rook. White defends them. The bishop escapes over here. And Vincent won a pawn in the game. So that was a little bit of an overpress. Maybe a drop of too much confidence from Harikrishna. But I don't feel like it was extremely disrespectful or anything. I think Hari and everyone at this tournament, understood that Vincent is a very strong player. But here it's just a small overpress in what could have otherwise been a very good draw by Vincent. I mean, he defended the game very well, played excellently, but normally if Harikrishna had not had some ambitions and some dreams of winning here, that would have been a drawn game. And now we get to the fourth game. And this is, arguably Vincent's best game even from the tournament. And as you can see, he's playing technical chess against the Queen's Gambit accepted. He's taking on c5, playing a very, very modest setup as white. And first chance he gets, he just rips the queens off, simplifying to a technical position. Of course, he could go queen c2, or he could wait for black to take if he were a tempo fiend in a position where tempi aren't that important. But he'd go straight into this, and yeah, I mean, this position is playable for a technical player, but nothing dramatically bad for black. I studied it a bit, and interestingly, Fedoseev just makes one main mistake in this game, which is he puts the bishop over on g6, and this becomes sort of a bad Slav bishop. If anybody knows, in the Slav defense, the bishop gets outside the pawn structure before black plays e6, Slav against the Queen's Gambit. And then one of the main plans for white is to try to trap that bishop with f3, e4, and sometimes even g4 and really sideline the piece. And then maybe play the other side of the board when the bishop can't get there. So I couldn't find any defense for Fedoseev after the bishop came to g6. I've tried lots of variations here and just basically completely lost with this piece stuck over here. White's going to attack this eventually with knight a5. And yeah, you'll see black, or I found that black couldn't really hold this structure together with the rook on f8, bishop on g6. White pushes the knight back, and now you've got eventually rook c7 to worry about. So black played b6. And we get a fancy trade of pieces, at the end of which white's just going to play bishop e3, attack that pawn. If the pawn goes to b5, then white's eventually going to attack the a pawn with knight b8. If he defends this way, you attack the pawn this way. And yeah, Vincent won an extra pawn, and the bishop's still on g6, and he eventually wins this game. Very, very nice game by him. Very, very clean technical game. There he wanted to play g5 so that he would actually have a pawn majority on this side of the board, so the bishop retreats to stop that. And then he takes over the bishop's diagonal on the queen side. And yeah, now the plan is a7, bishop b7, bishop d5. So a beautiful, beautiful game. You know, just profits from one error and plays one more great game. You know, and at that point he's won 4 games in a row, and he's winning 20 rating points. And he's up to the highest, you know, back up to the highest rating that he had some months back. So then follows a draw in round 5 and a wild game in round 6. So here we see, I think, some confidence in Keymer here in this game as he chooses a slightly less traditional approach to the position, right? I called him a more solid and positional player, you know. Said that he's playing a more calm repertoire with solid pawn structures and classical pawn structures, but okay. He is also a modern player. He's trained with the computers. He knows these alpha 0 rook pawn pushes. So here he gives us something fancy, going for h5, and after bishop g4, queen b3, hitting the pawn, and also looking at ideas like knight g5, which will attack f7 and unveil the bishop against these points. So Volokitin just says develop, 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 sacks the pawn. He backs fancy maneuvers back and forth. They're both working on their own now after the pawn sack. And here he keeps going in wild style. So very different than his previous 5 games. We got this position, tucks the king on g2. White is up a really bad pawn, basically, since queen takes b7, but this trade on f3 means that white's extra pawn is quite bad. It's b2 and d3 against c5. They're both backwards on open files, and I don't think that white actually has much advantage here until black allows this bishop trade, weakening his king. I think after bishop h6, if Volokitin plays bishop f6, right, so the bishop can defend around this pawn structure, and black keeps a more solid shell of squares, generally solid, no gaps and holes in the defense, right, of the squares. It's not so much for white, right? These pawns aren't looking very healthy. Queen on g1 has obviously got one idea in mind, you know, the black king. So we get the bishop trade, and then he's ahead, and he's got obviously the black king in bad shape. Here, by the way, there was an absolutely insane winning idea for white. Try I just show it for fun or leave it to you as a puzzle? We'll do both. Pause the clock, pause the video if you want to try and find this insane idea. Also, only if you're over 1800. This is not something for a beginner to break their mind trying to find. Not that 1700s are beginners. This is only a very elite. It's a very difficult thing. Don't hurt yourself for no reason if you don't want to. I'm not trying to assign too difficult work. This is a 2000 plus level idea. Pause it if you want to try and work on it for yourself. It's always fun to think a bit on your own. And now I will show you the answer. So white could attack with queen h7 check. King has to go to f6 because if it goes backwards, it's a pretty simple queen rook checkmate, right? But the king's been on f6, f7, etc. for a few moves, and Keymer hadn't seen a way to knock it out. And here it's the follow-up to queen h7 that is so shocking, and it's knight e4 check. Okay, if the king comes out, you've got knight c5 or various other moves. Knight g5 is good enough as well. So black has to take, and then white can take with this pawn. And basically, the king was safe on f6 because white had no piece to really get at it other than the queen, which lets the king back into his house, right? And the crazy thing is the knight tries to get at the king on that square, and then the pawn becomes the piece that can check the king. And really, if you look at the force count of attackers versus defenders, right? The black king is basically abandoned by the pieces. It was just that there was no piece that could check the king on f6. And now there is, and black is just dead. You know, not too much more to calculate. You know, e5, king here, there's going to be multiple ways to finish him off at that point between queen f7 and g4, and queen h3 is also instant mate. And if the king comes to e5 and tries to run, then he's going to be headed over here. And let's see if this is correct. No, black's winning. I could have sworn this was winning for white. I must have done something wrong. So I'll say this isn't going to work immediately because of knight d4. See if I can figure this out. Okay. I don't know for sure if this is the answer, folks. You'll have to check it for yourselves. I'm not going to run the engine right now, but here's an idea of what might be winning. The queen weirdly is going to cut off the 6th rank, so if the king keeps running, we can check and the knight can't block. And at the same time, I have the idea to either chase the king with f4, e5, or cut him off first with rook d1 and then try and finish with rook h5 or queen f5 or f4. If the king runs this way, there's no knight d4. This looks like a world of hurt, at least. Okay, an obscure idea, but super cool, this idea of like the knight sacking itself just to have a pawn ready. Okay, so, but Vincent plays queen c4, which is a perfectly strong move. He keeps his advantage, but he doesn't find like a clear knockout here. They're both in time trouble. You know, the queen comes back around. She's got access to h6 again, but you know, the king just comes here and he hasn't yet figured out how to win from this position. And finally, the king walks away from f6 and then resigns as the queen comes in. And now between knight e5 to g6 and queen h8 with the queen covering f6, king here, knight e5. It is truly done, and Volokitin resigns. So they were in this precarious position for black this game, but I feel like it's more like Volokitin blundered to win for white than Vincent was able to find the knockout. Overall, a great game, but not to me like the overwhelming precision that we saw when Fabi was in form at the Sinkfield Cup, for example. Anyway, we see a somewhat confident Vincent at this point. You know, he's not just trying to draw out the games to win the tournament. He's really trying right, with h4, h5, and queen b3. He's really trying to push and create a lively position. He's very confident throughout this game and remains confident after that. So at that point, he's at 5 wins and then 2 draws. Then we get to round 8. So after 7 rounds with 5 wins and 2 draws, he's won the tournament with 2 rounds to spare, which is fantastic. But he's still feeling confident and aggressive. And he plays a similar line against Sam Shankland just 2 rounds later. And this is, as I alluded to, sometimes getting the same position multiple times is really, really good for how well you play. It has the slight danger at these kind of levels of your opponent being prepared for it. And Sam Shankland had prepared for this game, and so he comes out of the gate playing very quickly and with kind of a weird idea in mind to allow h4, h5, and have to recapture with the f-pawn. Which looks terrible. White's rook is developed, black's king is weak, black's structure is split into 3 islands. So I think this is a line that looks terrible to me and that probably looked not great to Vincent as well. I mean, he's a much younger and more modern player than me. So I don't think, so when I say that he likes classical pawn structures, I don't think he's as stereotyped and as inflexible as I am, for sure, because that's like a big problem for me. And you know, he's a very fresh guy, but I would still suspect that this looks kind of nice for white to him. That would be my guess, that he would be confident at this point, happy with the position he's getting. But then Sam's playing super fast, so he's got to wonder, you know, you can see the clocks here that Shankland has more than the hour and a half that they started with, and Vincent's already spent 20 minutes. So he at least hadn't specifically prepared for this. He's not blitzing out all his moves like, oh yeah, FG, I checked that this morning, you know, here's how white punishes it. So he's using some time, and he's getting a bit behind on the clock, right? And after thinking for 25 minutes on queen b3, you see he's used half his time, and that's going to be a little bit of a disadvantage for him in what follows. I don't know if he was looking for a way to punish or to bail out at this point. It's hard to know or to guess, right? But I think he has, but if I had to guess, and just guessing, I would guess that he was still looking to punish, because I think in general he's in a pretty confident headspace at this point in the tournament. Okay, so he gets castled, knight c2. You can see the position's just absolutely wild. If rook b1, knight d4 doesn't look very good for white. Vincent had this move in mind, knight g5, from when he did his long calculation a couple moves before. Shankland has to cover queen f7. And now we get into this endgame. Knight d4, d3 to save the rook. Okay, so we get to this endgame. So I think Vincent would be reasonably happy with this endgame because he's got a small structural advantage and the position looks somewhat safe for white. At the same time, you know, I've talked to Sam, you know, and he was okay with the position he had as well at this point. So I think it's just, I think it's a position that either player could be okay with at this phase in the game. Shankland plays a very aggressive move, to me signaling that Sam was confident at this point as well, because this is a move which is opening up Sam's king based on he thinks his pieces are so well placed that he can gain an advantage by breaking up Vincent's pawn structure here. Yeah. It's such a complicated position. It's hard to say what I would play as black here without a deep think on every single move. But in general, my c4 is not a move that I would have even considered. My proclivities would be much more passive in this situation as black. It would be about picking a good spot for the king. Even though queens are off the board, everybody else is still on. So it'd be picking a good spot for my king. Maybe throwing in the move h6 so my rook is freed of defending this pawn, and trying to get my rooks to squares like d8 and f8 where I've got semi-open files. You know, so I'd be hoping to maybe tuck my king on b8 with this rook on c8 or d8, depending whether I need to defend the c pawn or stay active on the d file, and h6 and this rook coming to f8. So Sam plays a very aggressive move, and the pawn structure gets weirder with now an isolated pawn for white as well. And Vincent continues playing very aggressively, and I wouldn't have known it just playing through the game, but after doing some analysis, I decided that this move is the start of white's problems. It looks like an aggressive move with ideas against the king, like d6 and knight e6, with the black king in the center, but actually the move ends up sort of killing this bishop. And I think a simple move, just knight e4, where you've got this square and just all the pieces are still playing, is more flexible, and leaves white with whatever good chances. Let's say knight c5. It's not so obvious to deal with this diagonal. So white goes d5, looking for something really dynamic, with knight e6. But here Shankland kind of calms things down and turns the king from a danger into an asset with a really well-chosen pair of exchanges. He trades the bishop, which was attacked, so tempo fiends would also consider bishop takes c3. But you want to win this pawn, you want to put pressure on this diagonal. It's not totally obvious that we should be going for this, but tempo-wise, it does become obvious because you don't really have time to allow white knight c5 and d6 probably against the b7 pawn. So Shankland trades and trades, right? And reducing pieces is going to make the king want to be centralized more, right? Versus wanting to be hidden somewhere. And also removing the dark squared bishops and removing pieces in general reduces dynamism. And if d6 becomes not a good move, then this bishop becomes not a good piece. So, yeah, knight f4 was played here. I looked at also this move e4, which has, for example, black can't take yet because of this. So you have to be careful. I think that in general, black would like to trade the bishop for the knight and play knight versus this bishop and blockade white's pawns on light squares. But it's hard to trade on e6 because this capture comes with check, and e5 could come, bishop h3 could come, the rooks could come into f7 or d7 if you don't take the pawn. So it's just too dynamic at the moment if you make the trade on that square. So you would have to go bishop g4. I defended the c3 pawn for black's rook in analysis, and then play knight c4. And I think black's doing pretty well controlling some of these dark squares with the knight and king, and the game goes on as well. So knight f4 is the choice in the game. Looking at e4, knight takes g6, or bishop h3 in some case. But black threatens knight e3, which is a pretty big threat. So, for example, you can't play knight d3 because of knight e3. E4, bishop g4, rook d4, and now a very important move from Sam, knight e5. If you do something like g5, white plays knight d3. And suddenly white's got the idea of e5, and then both d6 and e6 are possible forever. And white can't stop the move e5 either because of a simple tactic, king d6, e5. You're like, what? I control e5, but there's the rook, right? So takes, grabs. So the position is very complicated, and I think this is a good illustration of it, that if white gets control of the dark square, then white's probably suddenly better. But Shankland, when making those trades, has calculated and assessed correctly that he's able to hold the dark squares. So he sets up the blockade now, threatening rook takes c3 again. Vincent comes after the knight, but now Sam's had time to bring his king up. And black is just unequivocally better with so slow play here because white's left with a bad bishop, and this king is amazing. The conversion is very slow, but actually black goes on to win the game without really too much doubt at any point. So you can tie white to any number of weaknesses. Actually, 4 of these 5 pawns are targets. An important advantage for black is the pawn majority over here. That's one of the main things that Sam threatened there, to go get this h pawn to h3 or so and make it another thing for white to worry about. So we get a rook trade, which again is improving the value of the king, improving the value of the passed pawn potentially on the h file. Here, a little detail. When I was looking at this, I was thinking, oh yeah, Sam's retreated the bishop. Okay, so here, I was already thinking, could we just go h4 yet, right? But he retreats the bishop, and I say, oh yeah, he's going to go to a4, and the rook's not going to be able to keep covering these pawns. And then he doesn't go to a4, right? So I was like, why not bishop a4? And then I found rook f2, and rook f5 check is annoying. Now we're just trading a bunch of pawns potentially, and white's rook becomes active, and that made me realize Sam played bishop e8 so that if white played rook f2, he would put the bishop on g6 and cover all the rook's incursion points while restarting pressure against e4. And if you go aggressive now, for example, rook takes c3, he's already threatening bishop e4. Before this rook can really get at any juicy targets, right? Rook g8, rook a8. So this bishop e8 move, that was subtle. I learned something from that. So now his plan is to bring the bishop to g6, potentially attack this. He can also strengthen the queenside more with a6, b5, and eventually he can go either h4 or maybe rook a4 attacking this pawn, force c4 and come back to this rank and pin the bishop and king, and then the e-pawn will probably drop because white won't be able to defend the third rank. So white feels like it's desperation time and gives up the defense of e4 and goes for king b2 to chase the rook out of the weak squares. Sam collects a pawn and we get into this endgame. And I can't explain every detail of this rook and pawn ending, but we can see that black's king is better placed than white's king and that black is up a pawn. Potentially a passed pawn here is going to be very far away from white's king. Personally, I'm not I don't know why Sam didn't take on g3 for several moves here. I'm sure there's a reason, but I'll just show you how this game ended. This is to prevent counterplay with rook takes a6. And he just kicks that rook out of the way, pushes the g-pawn, and then the pawn's just queening. And that was the end of that. Both the game and the streak. What do we learn from this streak? What sense do we make of it? Is Vincent about to win 10 games in a row and have people talk more about him than about some other prodigy? I feel like they've been taking turns being talked about, right? Abdusadarov got up to number 4, then Erigaisi played a bunch of opens and won them and got up to number 4. Gukesh played the candidates and won and got into the World Championship match. Praggnanandhaa, always on the tongue. The World Cup run and other things. But I think this was just a normal good tournament for Vincent. He gained some points, he won the tournament, and the streak, I think, in this case, was mostly just coincidence. He could have started with a couple wins, then lost one of the games that he lost, and then won a couple games at the end, or it could have been in this order. In round 9, he also lost. So he lost 2 in a row and still won the tournament by a full point. And in round 9, he played the second highest rated player in the tournament, Jan Krzysztof Duda, and lost Duda's best game of the tournament. Duda just played fabulously with white that round. So I don't think that Keymer got lucky. I don't think he was on better form than normal. You can take what I say as being positive or negative or for or against Keymer. You can say, oh, Pruess doesn't think he's like a genius who is going to win every game. That's criticism. Or you could say like, oh, Pruess thinks it's normal for him to win this tournament, that this is an average performance for Vincent that he could replicate. And you could say that's that's high praise or something. I don't know. You'll take it however you want to. But it's just my sober assessment that it's a little bit coincidental that he had this streak of 4 wins. I don't think it tells us anything really weird, and I don't think that we should expect to see Keymer be a very streaky player in his career. I think he's going to be a very consistent player who's going to be very highly rated. And if he plays in tournaments that aren't full of the other top 10 players in the world, he'll be able to win a lot of tournaments. If he plays in a lot of tournaments with the top 10 players in the world, he'll probably have more drawing streaks than winning streaks, and have a lot more tournaments that look like what we're used to nowadays, where somebody really good ekes out +1 or +2 against opponents who are also really good. But here, he was playing players, 40, 50 points below him, and he played well. Had some really nice games, and managed to win 5 games in a 9-round tournament, which is really quite a lot at this level. And raise his rating back up a notch, and just another good tournament for Vincent. And we'll have to wait around to see what's next for him. All right, those are my thoughts. Hope you're all having a great day and that you enjoyed some of those great games. 5 great games of Vincent's, 1 great game of Shankland's. So it goes, just because you're playing well doesn't mean that other people aren't also playing well. And that's why that kind of streak like Fischer had 50 years ago, or Fabi had just 10 years ago, almost feel like a thing of the past, a thing of history to me. Because even just 10 years later, it's hard to imagine that when you're on a streak, you won't run into some players who just try to kill the game against you to make a draw, or somebody else who's just playing so well that they can't lose either that week. It's getting harder and harder to imagine a form where somebody goes on a massive winning streak. But anytime we see someone win 3 or 4 games, our eyes are going to open, and we're going to be watching that as I was. As soon as I saw that Vincent had won the first 2 games of this tournament, I was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Let's keep our eyes on this. Is something crazy about to happen, something historical. So anytime we see somebody win three games in a row, I think you're going to see people talking about it and watching very closely and carefully. But I would be surprised to see at a plus 2,700 level another streak like Fabi's from 10 years ago. Yeah. All right, that's it for today. Have a great day, everybody. Catch you next time.